Please subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
All right. All right, guys, here it is. We have David Murrin back on our show. Uh, Look, sometimes people ask us some fundamental or some macro questions. Kevin and I, we always try to define everything by charts. But David, well, you guys, you had him for a few times on our show, and he's got a pretty complex, but also he's able to explain it pretty well, a global view of these big macro changes that's happening all around the world. War, no war, commodities, gold, the whole shebang. So welcome back, David.
hey, great to be back with you guys. Always is a pleasure.
All right. Well, let's get into it. Since the last time we talked, has there been any substantial changes to what you told us before? And how do you see things currently? And what's going to happen there in the next? People want to know, right? Probably in the next year or two. Like, what's on the landscape worldwide?
Okay, so I'm afraid I can't paint any rays of sunshine alighting on our heads because it is going to get worse. And just for those of you that haven't heard me speak before and us chat through this, essentially there's two or three major paradigms governing what's happening to us right now. One is the super Western Christian Empire, which is a meme in effect of Western nations that started in the 14th century with Portugal, through the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the British, the Germans, and America, are all basically one system with common values, have reached a point where it's in terminal decline, with America, the last of the Western Christian world, making a nosedive. And that nosedive started after 9/11, so it's 2 decades long, hence all the problems we see in America that we can alight on and discuss perhaps after this, when they're given the brief. The next problem we've really got is essentially that the Asian system has a super empire, starting with Japan, and Japan and China have been the second one. So this clash has been taking place since the Japanese-Russian War, where East met West. In the Second World War, the Japanese met the Americans and the British. And China is a second phase, and it's well and truly into this expansionary acceleration where it's committed to conflict. Whether it will admit it or not, everything it's doing right now is tooled towards World War III. And indisposed between that is this Kondratiev cycle, which Kondratiev, a Russian economist, sort of highlighted, which I've expanded beyond his original perception of interest rates and resource constriction to one of a pulse of entropy, entropy being chaos that pulses through the human system. And essentially every 112 years, we end up with major hegemonic conflicts, and halfway between that, minor conflicts. They're not minor if you're in them, but compared to the human race as a whole, they are. But every 112 years, we have a massive hegemonic, like titanic head-to-head, which dictates the next century and how humanity is led. You can go back to the Spanish, French, and the European continent. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars, which begat Britain. You can go back to the First World War, which is Germany's challenge to Britain, followed by the part two, which is World War II. It's really just with a pause. And now we're in this huge struggle with China at the epicenter, which is autocratic, and its autocratic allies against the world of democracy. It isn't north or south, as some people talk about. It's quite simply autocracy or democracy. And when you think of it this way, these great titanic struggles are about the future of humanity. Are we all to be batteries in the CCP's communist system, operating at 40% in a big, small cog in a massive system? Or do we believe that individuals have huge potential and need to be maximized as democracy believes? So make no mistake, this is a struggle afoot. It goes back to the time of Napoleon, when dictatorship was essentially perceived to be in Napoleon's hands. And they were monarchs, by the way, but they thought Napoleon was a dictator. The Kaiser was perceived to be a dictator. And certainly Germany finished off its period in the Second World War with the ultimate dictator, Hitler. So this is no different. It's a continuation of that theme. So that's the big picture. And none of the struggles that we have right now would be taking place in Russia, in the Middle East, with Iran, or in North Korea with its challenge, unless China was at a stage where it was at parity militarily to America. And that has emboldened its allies and the spokes of a wheel. And what we're seeing in Ukraine, we're seeing in the Middle East, and we're seeing with the North Koreans and their alliance structures, is that the whole thing is coming to a super kinetic stage. By definition, I would argue World War III started when Russia invaded Ukraine in 22, bang on time with my predictions, 8 years before the peak of the next Kondratiev cycle. So we're well and truly in it.
But David, I saw the interview there, Biden and Trump there, and Trump said he could stop this conflict like overnight there. Is that possible? What is that about?
There's nothing like the rantings of a narcissist to really get things going. But no, he thinks that by buying Putin off and saying, you Ukraine, I'm forcing you to accept your losses. That's his idea. It's the same with the far right, whether it's Hungary or it's France, or even Farage alluded to it. This idea that if you give the monster some meat, he'll leave you alone. Wrong. Because actually, Putin isn't the real monster. The real monster is right behind him, which is China. And China's ambitions are absolutely undeterred and will be, even if we bent over backwards, created a form of appeasement, sold the Ukrainians down the river, and tried to create a peace which wouldn't last more than 5 minutes.
There's a move to the right taking place and have been taking place across much of Europe, David, which has been interesting. I know France has been in the news over not just the last few weeks and months, but over the last few years with its sort of ever-present threat to move further and further to the right. And with the recent elections here in the UK, I think overseas perception has been that we've bucked the trend and moved to the left and elected a sort of left-wing government. But to my mind, that's not entirely true, because there's a rise of the right in the UK as well, with Reform UK, Nigel Farage, as he mentioned, and it's probably gone a little bit unnoticed by many overseas observers, but the shift of balance towards the slowly and sort of almost inevitably towards the right seems to be a factor here in the UK as well. How do you sort of see that? Sort of, is it the electorate just becoming completely exasperated with traditional politics and ever searching for ever more sort of radical leadership? Is that part of what you're
I think
talking?
you've touched on some really important points, Kevin, because essentially this entropic pulse, which generates this mode of conflict, also goes all the way down the fractal levels of society. And it's a natural response that when threatened, all systems move to the right. They become more nationalistic, more protective, all those things which we think of as strong leadership. In the worst form, it's dictatorship. In the best form, it's Churchill's benevolent dictatorship. And so the rise of the right is not a random phenomenon. It's bang on time. And you're correct in terms of the arrival of the right has been negated in terms of immediate access to power. But if you just take Farage, he broke the Conservative Party, which basically moved to the centre left, and thought it was going to win the high ground like Blair, which was a strategy 20 years old. And basically, he took the vote of traditional Tory members. He's added a very dangerous element, which is the illusion of the difference between the right and the far right, in my definition and understanding, is the far right are pro-Russian. So you see it with Le Pen, you see it with Farage and Trump, all with this forced peace in Ukraine. But what you don't see in Meloni in Italy is anything to do with that. She's uncompromising. She's a traditional right-wing politician. So the definition far right is pro-Russian, in my opinion, but right is the natural response. Stronger defense, stronger national identity. And even if you go and look at what's happened in France, Le Pen has reshaped politics. She's triggered a left-wing response at 160 votes. And they've got the bloc in the middle, which is 140, and she's 120. So we're seeing that right movement shaping our society. What we need to do is, instead of basically thinking, oh my God, the right's wrong, do not mix right-wing policies, which are self-deterministic and nationalistic, with the far right element, which is pro-Russian. We need to be far more like Italy in the way we go, rather than off to the far madness of Trump.
It wouldn't. I mean, speaking personally, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we saw Nigel Farage making a realistic run for Prime Minister in the UK in 4 or 5 years' time, because if Labour screw things up in the UK, that's the left-wing government here. If Labour don't do well, then I think by that stage it could very well be the case that voters are searching for that drastic alternative. So that wouldn't surprise me.
I would agree with you. And we must remember that we are still 6 years before the Kondratiev peak, where this entropic pulse, which drives things to the right, is going to alleviate. It's going to get far worse. So the Labour Party, much as they've got this lovely view that the bad people are in charge, and now the good people are in charge, they can fix everything, they are very linear in the way they approach things. And the only way you solve the kind of structural failures that we have in Britain is by lateral thinking and lateral reform, which is just not even within Starmer's grasp. So failure is inevitable. And I agree with you that all this is doing is setting the whole of Europe up for an even bigger swing to the right of definitive right-wing power. And what we need to hope is it's conservatives who become and find themselves to be right-wing but not far-right, rather than anyone that has sympathies towards Putin, which I think is intolerable for a democracy.
Is there a case to be made, or maybe that is the case you're making, that no matter what, it's like whatever political party it is, it's out of their control because there's bigger forces in play that's driving this whole show, and whatever's happening politically, it's almost, I don't want to say predestined, but it's a pendulum swing that started a while back, and it's a cycle that just repeats over and over again.
You have absolutely put your finger on it. And, we look at charts and we look at cycles in markets. What we're looking at here is the biggest cycle that I can see in history of this 112-year entropic pulse that creates hegemonic conflict and, right to the bitter end and decides the next century's way of human leadership. So we are in it, and it only ends up with one piece, which is everyone ending up in this conflict, because currently all our leaders in the West are completely weak. I mean, Biden, Sunak, you'll name them. They've done everything that they could do to pave the way to conflict by their appeasement. And so now the conditions are set. Even if you suddenly had a much more nationalistic and dynamic Western leader, they just don't have enough time to change the balance of power sufficient to deter the aggressor states which are set up and ready to pounce.
Yes. It reminds me of the stock market, Kevin. It's when these big cycles, when the SPX starts rolling over versus, let's say, commodities, they can't just recuperate overnight, right? It's like it has to play out 5 years, 10 years, whatever the cycle was before. In times, often it matches on the other side. But I'm wondering now about these wars, like, I don't want to, like, the industrial military complex, how these wars, like there's one in Iraq that, I don't know, lasted 10 years, 12 years, Afghanistan, all countries seem to have these long lasting wars, which it feels like the end game is not to nuke the other guy, but it's just to sell artillery shells, like just constantly make money by selling the consumables. Is that
so? So one of the things I highlighted in Breaking the Code of History is not all wars are the same wars. So there are wars of expansion, when a system that is expanding literally takes on its neighbors and is the aggressor. It wants more, therefore it uses trigger points to create those conflicts. And there's another type of conflict, which is a defensive conflict, which essentially is one where you just have to fight for your very survival, like Ukraine. What took place in the Middle East was the last act of hubris after 9/11. It was a neocons deciding to shape the world in terms of democracy and to remove the threat of countries that could be proliferating, like Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And they landed on, Iraq, even though the evidence for weapons of mass destruction was poor, on maybe chemical weapons, but certainly not nuclear weapons, on the basis of the last vestiges of expansion before they entered into contraction unknowingly. That war was optional. It didn't have to be treated that way, didn't have to be conducted that way, and it was sucking the life out of what was left of the American system, and it failed dramatically. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, every intervention failed. But the wars we're in now are of a very different nature. They're not of an optional nature. They are of a very, very fundamental survival nature. What Russia is doing to Ukraine and would do to the eastern borders of NATO is about the survival of those countries. In the same way, China plans to dominate the whole world. Its plan is to build a navy that's 10 times the size of anything we have in 5 years and come out and dominate the seas until we all give up, which is how Britain built its empire. It literally took India by controlling the trade routes around India. So we are now in a battle of very survival. There is no option, as there was in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So are you saying
we did have to do something, but what we did wasn't the right route.
Yeah.
It was neoconservative driven.
So by the looks of it, it's like almost predestined that you're saying, like, let's say China's way, they're going to regain a dynasty worldwide. They're incoming. It's like, and
They're certainly going to attempt to,
they're
and
going to
that
attempt to.
involves a fully blown World War III, and we better get our heads around it because it's
And
not very far away now.
what are the percentage chances that we win? Well, when I say we, because I live in North America, or like that we that's China staved off, and we just come back to what we know now. There is this possible that what my lifestyle that I have now, that I keep it, or I have to
So at the rate we're going, our odds are getting shorter and shorter.
Mm,
Okay, so let's look at what's going for China. China has the world's biggest industrial base. And under the scenario that if I was a Chinese planner, I would seek to execute Pearl Harbor 2 to expand my influence out to the third island chain, eject America from it. And they built missile systems that could do that in a number of days. And the question is, can they reach Australia or not, which is the fight back base? If Australia acts like the bastion it did in the Second World War, then America can fight back into the region. If it doesn't, and they push it out, then it's all change. Now, that seems like a long shot because we think American power is untouchable. We thought battleships were once untouchable until carriers came along. But the technology of anti-ship ballistic missile systems has been demonstrated in the Red Sea. And that little conflict that most people don't realize has completely negated American maritime hegemony because the US Navy can't keep the Red Sea open when the Houthis are using basic ballistic missiles and basic targeting systems, and they can't. The Chinese have sophisticated versions in their thousands. So it's very real, and it reminds me of the Spanish Civil War, where the Germans spent the Condor legions. They learned how to fight the form of blitzkrieg warfare. So Hitler knew how blitzkrieg worked because the Spanish Civil War allowed him to develop it. And that's exactly what the Red Sea is. It's a development program for the Chinese plan to literally remove Japan, South Korea, and American influence from the region.
goodness gracious.
And
I don't know
so,
what to say.
so you'll be able to live comfortably for a
Yeah.
time. But there's a second phase to the Chinese plan, and that is its shipbuilding capability means that in 5 years, it could build a navy that's so huge that when it decides to venture forth, it'll take continent by continent. And all you have to do is look at the lessons of Western history. American military dominance came in the Second World War from the largest industrial base, from building more ships and carriers than anyone else could. And then, just like Britain, all you need to do is go and you can take continents by controlling their trade routes in this interrelated world. So at the moment, and even in terms of the advancement of our weapons, the Chinese are showing huge innovation, huge. And now they've got submarine technology from Russia. The subsea domain that was ours is going to be under challenge. There's not a single place that looks comfortable to the West anymore.
Well, do they want to colonize us? Do they want us to speak Cantonese, or they just want our resources, say I control, and they just tax each country and bring the money back to motherland,
I think the
China?
most resources, obviously, you need to feed your algorithm of expansion. But what's really important to understand is that most of us make a fundamental error when we go through life. We project our psychology onto everyone else around us. We think other people think like us. And we're constantly surprised when they don't. And we keep doing it even as adults. And certainly, Western democracy and liberal democracy can't imagine how the Communist Party sees capitalism and how Xi sees capitalism. And it's very simple. We're a virus. The idea of individual thought, individual action brings down the whole edifice of autocratic hierarchical power. So basically, they would only feel safe if they destroyed every free-thinking human in the Western world. And they've created social algorithms to do that. They control their own population using these social credit systems. They did it to the Uyghurs, who are hostile. They did it to the Hong Kong Chinese. 6 decades of independence wiped out in months using these algorithms.
Surely part of the thinking, though, David, must be that from the Chinese side of things, that if they push too far and this turns into a much broader conflict and a physical conflict as opposed to a war of a war of words, a war of ideologies, a war of technology and that kind of thing. But if it turns into a hot war between China and NATO, China, and the United States, then you're talking about the threat of nuclear weapons. Now, surely the Chinese calculations must also include the thinking that that would be completely fruitless, because even if they were to have the ability to drop nuclear weapons on targets in the West without them being retaliated against in a similar fashion, they would surely know that the nuclear knock-on effect from that radiation effect would be completely negate the point of the process.
So everything the Chinese plan to do is under the nuclear ceiling, which is why the Chinese have been the biggest restraining force to Putin. When he starts threatening to use nuclear weapons, he won't, and he can't, because the Chinese won't let him do it, because they want to inherit a world, not to turn it to ash. But their basis of the challenge under the nuclear threshold is that the West is led by weak people, that when push comes to shove, they want to take another breath rather than actually use a nuclear weapon to protect their territory. And I'm afraid that we've given all those signals, from the route from Afghanistan, our failure to support Ukraine, to virtually support Ukraine to victory rather than sustenance in the fight, basically just proves a lack of Western willpower. So until we develop leaders that really are hard-willed and said, our red line is, and we will, and they believe it, the moment they have free reign to operate under the nuclear ceiling.
I mean, part of the process could very well be to weaken Western nations through techniques and methods that we're almost not even noticing. What I'm talking about there is, for example, the offshoring of our manufacturing industrial base, which has been going on for decades, our reliance on Chinese goods and services, and who knows what may possibly be unfolding when it comes to currency, for example, and the US dollar, the dollar index, and how gold plays a role in that. So the way world trade is operated has for many decades now, obviously relied on the US dollar and oil being the main sort of commodity currencies and exchanges. So if that was to change, wide scale, when it comes to countries like India, China, Russia, Brazil, the BRICS countries, then that would continue to have a destabilizing effect on the whole debt sustainability issues, the economic sustainability issues that we see in the West. And you can look at the way Pat and I look at the charts and the way that you're describing what you're seeing. It kind of knits together like a jigsaw puzzle, that what you're saying sort of explains what we're seeing in the charts. I mean, we're technical chart analysts, and we can see stuff pointing in a particular direction, and it's not looking great. We're talking. Pat and I have been talking about this kind of problem that we have with debt sustainability in the West, the fact that the 10-year yield is breaking out, the fact that a 5% rate on 10-year government bonds at the moment has a sort of almost a crippling effect in the same way that 10 or 12% did back in the 1970s due to the debt to GDP ratio. So debt to GDP is now something approaching 130% in the US. It was around about 30% back in the 1970s. So that, to my mind, helped when it came to controlling the issue, because by rapidly raising interest rates, somehow or other, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, the problem was contained, or at least kicked down the road further. But that whole debt to GDP and debt sustainability issue seems to be worsening, and the charts are pointing to a capital rotation between stock markets and commodities and precious metals. And if all of this sort of ties in together, then, and also the yield curve inversion that we're seeing at the moment as well, with the 10-year yield and the 2-year yield, which has been inverted for a period of time, which is almost unprecedented. I think maybe during the Second World War, it was in a similar situation. But we're seeing things happening now that are eerily kind of like echoes of the 1930s, and with a little bit of the 1970s thrown in. So it feels like we're in this kind of like a hybrid of the 1930s and the 1970s, almost like we're building up to something, and that something's really not good. And what you're describing there, and that your book there, Breaking the Code of History, it kind of fills in a lot of the sort of the background to what these charts are pointing towards. It kind of makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit. I just hope that what you're describing doesn't lead to complete sort of annihilation of half of the human race. I mean, what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on in Ukraine is horrific, and it's almost becomes embedded in your expectations now. Oh, there's a war going on in the Middle East, 30, 40,000 people are dead, wars going on in Ukraine, tens of thousands are dead. And it's almost as though it's accepted by Western society almost. And at some point, it kind of feels like, that it could cross a threshold where this becomes a lot more immediate to Western civilization.
Everything you said, I agree with. I mean, I can't, I think, I too, use my models for every chart pattern I can see is aligned to this outcome, which is the safe havens are moving, precious metals are going to break up again. And Bitcoin is exactly the same. It's for now a safe haven perception. The dollar is weak, and cable especially is about to make like a once in a 2-decade break higher. So the dollar's weak. Most importantly, debt markets are highly vulnerable in Europe and the US, and they're going to take a lurch lower. The commodity cycle is, oil close to breakout on 80, 85, and you see it in copper. So the commodity cycle is kicking in. The emerging markets, which are going to be capital's breath, are looking super vulnerable. Everything at the moment in short, medium, and long term aligns to the discussion we've talked about of escalation taking place in the next weeks and months of this year. And just to highlight that, what's going on in Ukraine is absolutely terrifying. The scale of that war is the Battle of Stalingrad. If you've studied military history, that was huge. The casualties, the scale of it, it's unbelievable. The fact in the modern world, we are seeing this degree of conflict. And we're now seeing North Koreans due to come and join and support the Russians on the front. It's received so little press, but North Korean soldiers are going to fight alongside Russians against Ukrainians, so-called digging tunnels, but they'll be doing other things too. And this is just part of the process where China wanted a plausibly deniable ally, which is North Korea, and North Korea is sending troops because she wants them to be sent. So this is the next stage of the escalation. And at the same time, because of the broad front assaults the Ukrainians have been making, essentially they've had to now strike into Russian territory. And Biden's tried to contain the strike footprint. But you can't, because the Russians just move outside the footprint and do it from somewhere else. So escalation along the whole border is now inevitable. And then if you go to the Middle East, I believe the Iranians are making their nuclear breakout. They have done from the moment the missile attack took place, and they banned IE inspectors. So we've got the Iranians making a nuclear breakout. Hezbollah is attacking Israel consistently, and with or without peace in Gaza, it's the threat which has to be dealt with for the Israelis. So the Middle East is all ready to go up in flames. So either way I look at it, it's like a giant keg of gunpowder with multiple fuses being lit. And the only question is which one gets to the gunpowder first. But there's enough of them that the outcome is now inevitable. And judging from all the price patterns in all the markets I look at, it's really in front of us now because they're set up to respond that way.
Okay, David. Are there any final thoughts to wrap up on before we tell our viewers where they can find all your work? Any sort of final anything that you haven't covered there that you think
there is. We in 1914. And you mentioned I think the parallels actually are between the peak of the Kondratiev cycle into 75. And so we're at about 69, 70 in parallels. And actually, it's not what happened in the 30s. It's what happened into 1914, because the Kondratiev cycle was in a very similar phase. And that's exactly where this hegemonic trigger comes from. So looking for where the apples make apples, that's where I look at the cycle parallels. But what we're talking about here is really tough. And there is evidence that, into 1914, there was massive denial that Britain could go to war with its once ally Prussia, and there would be a world war. No one could really quite get their head around it. So if you read the press, they were shocked and surprised, but Britain was more prepared than we are today. Our collective denial after years of peace is therefore natural, but we've compounded it because we pushed the stock market through the roof. And that has created dopamine everywhere. Now, where's the peak going to come? I think Nvidia made its peak a week and a half back. And it's basically in the correcting before it goes down again, which means the indexes are very close to the peak. And the thing to look for was in the stock market's reverse, the dopamine will stop pumping and the cortisol will start flowing. So people will suddenly see their reality around them and be shocked. And that'll just cascade into the next leap. So denial is difficult, but for those of you that listen to this, you're regular listeners to Pat and Kevin, who are arch realists like myself. And essentially, it's far better to accept the reality of where we are and create an adaptive structure than is to keep wearing the blindfold before you hit the brick wall, because there is a way out of everything. And there is a way for the West. We just need to wake up, and more of us need to demand more from our politicians, to spend more on defense, to be far more proactive, and to move urgently. So it's not as if there aren't things we can do that basically mitigates the damage ahead. And that's been my mission at Global Forecaster. And that's why it's a great pleasure to talk to you about this today, because I believe there is hope, but we do need to all wake up and act.
Thank goodness we got to that word hope at the end there, David. I think we needed that. It's I'm a sort of glass half full sort of person by nature, and I always do try and search for a way out of these horrendous situations in life. So let's just focus on that word hope there, and as you say, hope that our politicians are great leaders, or not so great leaders, are able to navigate a way through this. But regardless of that, as you say, I think there's an incredible amount of turbulence and difficulties to work our way through over the next several years, and all of the charts are pointing to that, and all of your work is pointing to that as well. So thanks for your thoughts on that, David. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find your work? Because I think a lot of people will be wanting to keep up with your thoughts on this. So where can they find your
come to my site, davidmurrin.co.uk. It's Global Forecaster site. And there you'll find Murrinations, and the Murrination portions are all about like the geopolitical scenarios I've talked about in detail, and updates that you'll need to keep you abreast of what's going on. Not what you see in the press, but really how information unfolds. It's backed up by all my work on charts and the predictions that look at timing, although that's not part of the Murrinations, I'm afraid. That's a higher level of the site application. But everyone, I urge you to get educated, to understand what's happening. And the result of that is you can talk to your friends about it, demand more of politicians, and be better prepared. And there is always a way out of difficult situations, but you've got to have that appraisal of what the situation is first. And as a society, we don't have that. So each of you have a mission to spread the word, get educated, and please follow my Murrinations.
All right. Great stuff,
David?
man.
Yeah, thanks, and don't
Thanks.
forget to subscribe for more content like this as well if you like it, and put your comments in the comments below.
Please subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Thanks, guys.